As the black and white world was turning into Technicolor in the 1960s, the musical landscape continued to grow, and the Monkees, a byproduct of this exploding music scene, became a television pop sensation, even outselling the Beatles for a brief time. And we're going to learn about their rise and fall here on Pop Goes the 60s.
Listen to the band.
One of the most amazing phenomenons to come out of 60s pop culture were the Monkees. It's the story of a fictitious TV band that actually became famous and ultimately became a real band. And I'm sure many of you know the basic story, and what I want to do here on Pop Goes the 60s in a couple different series is talk about that story, which is very rich in detail, by the way. And as always here on Pop Goes the 60s, we're going to dive deep into their music catalog. Let's begin. Our story begins with the collaboration of two guys, one by the name of Bert Schneider and the other Bob Rafelson. Now, both of these guys were born in 1933, and both had family links to the television film industries. Bob Rafelson was the cousin of screenwriter and playwright Samson Raphaelson, the author of The Jazz Singer. And he actually developed the idea for the Monkees, this kind of fictitious band, in 1962. But he wasn't able to sell it. It was unsuccessful. Now, Bert Schneider was the son of Abraham Schneider, head of Colpix Records and Screen Gems television units of Columbia Pictures. So these guys had a little bit of a little nepotism going on and were able to get into the industry. And together they wanted to form a company, which they did, and they called it Raybert Productions. And I'll occasionally refer to them collectively as Raybert. And ultimately, they wanted to produce feature-length films. And the way to do that is to get into television first. So this Monkees project was the vehicle to get them to their ultimate goal. Now, like a lot of things in the 60s, Raybert's timing was really good because obviously the Beatles were huge and they had done A Hard Day's Night and Help. So the time seemed right for something like this to go on to television. And they were able to sell this idea to Screen Gems in April of 1965. So once they got that far, they had to start putting together a cast and start getting music together. So the original idea was actually to hire an actual band. And the band that they considered was the Lovin' Spoonful. Now, this is in early 1965 before the Spoonful was really known at all, but the Spoonful declined. Another group that they considered was the Dave Clark Five, but that, for whatever reason, did not work out either. With those groups falling through, Rafelson and Schneider turned their sights to Davy Jones. Davy Jones was a young performer who had signed a contract with Screen Gems and Columbia Pictures, and he signed this in September of 1964. So he was kind of an up-and-coming star looking for his lucky break. And his involvement with this project was announced in the press in July of 1965. Now, Davy Jones was from Manchester, England, and he had already been on stage as the Artful Dodger and in a Broadway production of Oliver, for which he was nominated for a Tony Award and Best Featured Actor in a Musical in 1963. And Davy had also trained as a jockey, so he had several talents in addition to singing. So he was also in the process of doing some recording and recorded an album and some failed singles. Here's the album for Colpix called Davy Jones. With Davy Jones already under contract, Raybert turned their sights to getting three more guys. And to do this, they put an ad in the Daily Variety and the Hollywood Reporter. And it said, "Madness, auditions, folk and roll musicians, singers." And this was cleverly worded in place to attract a certain type of person. And they had over 430 applicants for this. Now, one other person that was already basically involved with television was Mickey Dolenz. Now, Mickey was the son of actor George Dolenz, and he had done a television show in the 50s called Circus Boy as a child actor. And at this point, he was doing pilots. He was still in the business and looking to get another role. So he heard about the Monkees project through his agent, and because of his background, he was able to do a private audition. Now, one person who actually did see the advertisement was Mike Nesmith. Now, he had been in LA for a little while. He's originally from Houston, Texas. He had driven to LA with a wife and kid in his broken down jalopy, and he was recording some music and even publishing some of his songs and playing folk music. So he was also looking for something bigger because he was not making it in the music industry. One other thing about Nesmith, many of you may know, is that his mother had invented liquid correction paper for the typewriter, which eventually became Liquid Paper, the corporation. So in the 60s, the company was still kind of getting its feet under itself and doing well, but not a huge thing yet. So Mike thought he could make it as a folk singer, and that's where it was all happening in Los Angeles, so that's where he wound up. Mike had served a brief stint in the United States Air Force, and he recorded a couple singles on the Colpix label under the name Michael Blessing. So Mike did very well in the audition and was invited to come back and do a screen test, which he also did very well on. So they needed one more guy, and one person they targeted was Jerry Yester of the Modern Folk Quartet. The Modern Folk Quartet was actually going by the name the MFQ at this point in 1965, now doing folk rock, and they had been a popular folk act. And Jerry Yester is the brother of Jim Yester, who was in the association. And he was kind of the clown of the group, and they really wanted him. So Davy Jones and music supervisor Lester Sill went down to see him at a club, and they approached him, but he was loyal to his group and would only do it if the whole group could come along and be on the show with him, which was not going to happen, so he declined. Another candidate also had some Hollywood roots, and that was Mickey Rooney Jr. Now, Mickey Rooney Jr. and his brothers had a group called the Roonies, and they were aspiring musicians and around, and he actually declined the role. Now, in addition to considering groups like the Lovin' Spoonful and the Dave Clark Five, another group that was briefly considered were the Wellingtons. Now, this is a group that's not very well known. You may recognize that name from the credits of Gilligan's Island because they sang the theme song, and they also appeared on the show as the Mosquitoes, but they were soon jettisoned. Now, there's other Monkee hopefuls, and a pretty impressive list here. So one was successful songwriter Paul Williams, who became successful later. Now, Paul Williams actually had lost out to Mickey Dolenz for the role of Circus Boy in the 50s, and he lost out again on the Monkees role. Brian McLean, future member of Love, also tried out. Beach Boy affiliate Van Dyke Parks. Bobby Boris Pickett, singer of Monster Mash. Mark and Matt Andes, later of groups like the Yellow Balloon, Spirit, JoJo Gunn, Firefall, and Heart. Actor-singer Eddie Hodges. Paul Peterson of The Donna Reed Show, Danny Hutton, later of Three Dog Night, songwriter Harry Nilsson, and even Pete Best, formerly of the Beatles, was asked, apparently. Now, I got this from his bandmate, songwriter Tony Waddington. Tony Waddington became a fairly famous songwriter, and I had him on this show, and he talked about that. So Pete Best was considered, and I don't know how it was brought up to him, but add him to the list. We also have Rodney Bingenheimer, DJ in Los Angeles Gadfly. One very popular person that did not make the cut was Charles Manson. Now, this is a myth. Now, Manson was incarcerated between the years 1961 and 67, so there was no way he could have tried out for this. So this rumor started, I believe, with Rodney Bingenheimer. He had mentioned this and that Manson was a candidate. So I don't know if he was just pulling people's leg, but of course people ran with it. Now, Bingenheimer, as it turned out, eventually was used as a stand-in for Davy Jones because they were both rather small in size and had a similar build and similar hair. Now, some of the other applicants included Bill Chadwick, who was a collaborating songwriter with the Monkees eventually. He did a screen test. Paul Potash, a folk singer and actor. Voice actor and actor William Calloway. Actor Joey Cooper, who was a member of the Shindogs. They were the house band for the Shindig TV show. And finally, actor Michael Burns, who's probably most known for his role on Dragnet as Blue Boy. The highest profile applicant that did make it was Stephen Stills, soon to be of the Buffalo Springfield. Now, Stills actually saw the advertisement, and he had some connections musically, and he was a very gifted musician. And Raybert really liked Stills. They were really high on Stills. And I think one of the reasons is because he was blonde. And I think they needed something to balance out the three beautiful brunettes. So I think they were looking for a lighter, a fair-haired person. Stills obviously fit that bill. Great musician and great songwriter. Now, the story goes that, well, he didn't have good enough teeth and he had a receding hairline. I don't really buy that because Mike Nesmith also had a snaggletooth and receding hairline cleverly hidden under his wool cap. So if they really wanted Stills, they could have got him and fixed those things. But as it turns out, Stills didn't have what the others had, and that was a reckless abandon for television. He was a little more reserved. So that's really the reason I think they didn't go with him. And ultimately, Stills did not want to give up his publishing. So to do songs for the show, he would have had to partner or sell some of his publishing to Screen Gems, because they were only using Screen Gems publishing. He did not want to do that. Anyway, Raybert really liked Stills, and they got on really well. So as they talked, Stills said, well, you know, I know a guy who looks kind of like me, who's a folkie. His name is Peter Tork. So they got a hold of Tork through Stills. Tork came down, did the screen test, and performed really well and was the fourth Monkee. Born in Washington, D.C., Peter Tork grew up in the Northeast, and he made his way down to the Greenwich Village folk scene, and that's where he met Steve Stills. And for a while, they were together in a group called the Buffalo Fish. And he relocated to L.A. like every musician was going out to L.A., and he was trying to find work. And at the time of the Monkees, he was washing dishes for like $50 a week in between music gigs. So it was a big deal for him, and he tested well, and obviously they had their fourth Monkee. While choosing applicants, Rafelson and Schneider were also looking for music for the show, and they turned to a couple of Screen Gem writers, Boyce and Hart. Now, Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart also thought they had a shot for being on the show. I mean, they were young, and they kind of fit, but Rafelson and Schneider never really considered them, just having them concentrate on the music, which was the priority for those guys. So Boyce and Hart, at the time, they were doing some incidental music for Days of Our Lives, and they had written a very big hit for Jay and the Americans. As Screen Gems and Columbia Music artists, Boyce and Hart were hired to come up with 3 songs for the pilot. Now, the group hadn't been named yet, so Raybert was trying to come up with a name. One of the names considered was the Creeps. Another was the Inevitables. And finally, the Turtles. So little did they know, I think a band had just named themselves the Turtles in LA, but they chose the Monkees, and that seemed to fit perfectly, and they never looked back. Now, Rafelson and Schneider were kind of upstarts, and they weren't really viewing this project as, old Hollywood. And the studio kind of frowned upon them hiring some amateur actors, but Raybert realized that that was something that they needed. It would be more believable and more natural. So ultimately what you had were 2 guys with really no acting experience in Tork and Nesmith. Now, Nesmith actually did some stage acting in college, and Tork was a folk performer, so he was used to working with an audience, but nothing on the level of Jones and Dolenz. Now, Dolenz was a musician on some level. As a kid, he played Spanish guitar. He was in a group recently called the Missing Links, where he played guitar and sang, and he could read music, which is often not told. Now, Davy Jones had never played an instrument, but he was pretty much a gifted singer and was singing for a while professionally. So the next decision was, well, who's going to play which instrument? So Tork and Nesmith both were guitarists, and Nesmith insisted on playing the guitar. And Nesmith out of the gate was the most headstrong of the 4 of them. And that kind of left Tork on bass guitar. Mickey volunteered to play drums, and I think he chose that. It saw the drums playing as more of a prop. Now, Davy Jones had never played an instrument. So in the pilot, they had Davy Jones on another guitar as well. And that's how it started. Eventually, Davy just played mostly percussion instruments and an occasional guitar or keyboard later. Now, based on actual ability, according to Peter Tork, Davy Jones was the better drummer. And I think there was some concern about putting Davy Jones, a small guy, behind a drum set that you wouldn't see him. But it might have made some sense because Mickey Dolenz could have been out front on guitar because he was a guitar player. So Peter Tork was the better guitar player between him and Nesmith, but Nesmith wanted to play guitar. And Tork also played piano and banjo in addition to bass. So he was the most well-rounded musician out of the 4 of them. The pilot was shot in November of 1965, and through the beginning of the following year, early 1966, the band was just kind of waiting for the results of selling the pilot. So they busied themselves while they were in Los Angeles. Mike was working at the Troubadour. He was an MC on Hoot Nights. Peter also partook in the music scene. at one point even opening up for Muddy Waters. Mickey guested on the show Peyton Place. Davey was on Ben Casey, and he was also offered a pilot about a policeman and a leprechaun, where I guess the policeman could only see the leprechaun and they solved crimes or whatever. Guess who played the leprechaun? Now, during this time, the guys were pretty broke, especially Peter and Mike. Mike had an apartment with his wife, and they invited Peter to stay with them, so they put Peter up for a while. Meanwhile, Mickey Dolenz invited Davy Jones to spend time with the Dolenz family over Christmas of 1965 because Davy was from England, and he had to stay in Los Angeles to wait on the show. And oftentimes, Mike and Phyllis would invite them over, and they'd have a big dinner just on $10 and have this sumptuous feast. And so they were getting kind of tight then and got to know each other, at least in these early times, waiting to see if the show was even going to happen. Now, the reaction to the pilot was very strange. Usually you have positive or negative, but I guess the reaction was there was no reaction. It was complete indifference. And Jackie Cooper was the head of the department. He was very put off by this. He said, I've never seen anything like this. So they went back and edited the pilot. And I think a lot of people didn't understand the show. Now, the show had a lot of fast cutting, and it was a new style and a new pacing. And what Raybert did was to add some of the screen tests of the guys to the show so that the people in the audience could get to know the guys. And once they did that, everybody started giving it the thumbs up. Frustrated waiting for the news, Davy Jones was planning to go back and just go into jockeying, but Mike Nesmith kind of talked him out of it. And it wasn't long after that, it was in February of '66, that they sold the show to NBC. This was the beginning of a frantic work pace that they had to undertake. And one of the first things they did in the month of March is they started a 5-week improv course with director Jim Frawley. So these guys could get some pacing down, their timing down, the jokes down, and just get the rapport down with one another. In addition to that, Raybert also got the guys' instruments. They wanted the guys to play together and form a musical connection. And there was still some idea that the boys, the four Monkees, would actually contribute musically to the show. That was the intention. But how do you know until you get in some instruments? So that's what they did. Now, the results were not that good. They were disappointing. Now, Peter Tork called them directionless and unproductive, musically speaking. Now, one person I'd like to mention here that entered the picture in a bigger way was Don Kirshner. He was the president of Screen Gems and Columbia Music. And he had owned record labels and publishing and in the Brill Building world, which he still operated out of in New York. And it was only a matter of time before they would need his help to furnish songs for the show. So he started getting brought in at this time, but Lester Sill was the guy who ran the Los Angeles office. So he was really the guy that they were answering to in the beginning. As I mentioned before, there was kind of a stipulation that the Monkees would be playing some of their own music or writing their own music. Anyway, Mike Nesmith thought that. He not only thought that he'd be playing his own music, but also writing songs and producing. So that was his understanding of the situation. And once Kirshner came in to kind of evaluate the talent, he found Nesmith to be the weakest vocalist out of all of them. Now, Nesmith expected to be the lead singer. And so there was a clash right off the bat between Kirshner and Nesmith. And as I said earlier, Nesmith was headstrong, and he was already becoming a pain in the ass to Kirshner. Now, from the very beginning, Boyce and Hart were also promised by, I shouldn't say promised, but Raybert gave the impression that Boyce and Hart were the guys that were going to produce all the music for the show, which made sense. They did the pilot, and it went very well. And so they were hitting the ground running here. But Kirshner had to give the okay on that. And Kirshner felt that they were unproven. Now, Lester Sill, who ran the Los Angeles office, thought Boyce and Hart were fine, but it was really Kirshner that made the decisions on this. Now, one of the things Kirshner did was he wanted to bring in his own producer. So he approached Mickey Most. Now, Mickey Most had been producing hits for Herman's Hermits, and that's the first guy he thought of. But Most couldn't make it happen. He was living in England. He would have had to spend too much time in Los Angeles away from his family, so that didn't work. So the next guy he approached one of his boys, Snuff Garrett. So Snuff Garrett had been producing Gary Lewis and the Playboys, had tons of success through 1965, like 8 top 10 singles. So Snuff Garrett was really hot at the moment. And he had produced Will You Still Love Me? And he was kind of an old school style of music. And that's what Kirshner was still hearing in his head, Brill building. And the thing with Snuff Garrett is he was so busy with the Playboys. And Kirshner wouldn't take no for an answer. So Snuff Garrett signed a contract. So right off the bat, the Monkees did not get along with Snuff Garrett. Garrett was also a little bit of a brash guy in the producer's chair, and he made the decision that, hey, Davy Jones is going to be the lead singer. Well, the other Monkees had a conniption, and it all blew up. So Garrett leaves and goes back to Texas, and Kirshner's trying to get a hold of him, and Garrett says, "Look, I got a contract. Like, I don't give a fuck what those guys say. This is my decision. This is how I'm doing it." So Kirshner, I think, realized that, well, I can't have the Monkees hating the producers. So Kirshner ended up buying Garrett out of his contract. The next person that was brought in, Kirshner goes back to his old group again. He brings in Carole King and Jerry Goffin, two other Brill building people. So they come in and they lasted like a day. Apparently Lester Sill said that Carole King took a flight home in tears. So the Monkees were like dispensing of these producers one after another. Mind you, the show isn't even on the air yet. So that's how this is all beginning. And that's how these guys were essentially dealing with the production side of the music business. So Don Kirshner is running out of East Coast options here, and Boyce and Hart have been saying, hey, we'll do it. Let us do it. So finally, Kirshner relents because he almost has no choice. But it makes total sense because Boyce and Hart created the sound of the Monkees with the pilot, and it made sense for them to carry through. So what they did, like they did with the pilot, is they used their band, the Candy Store Prophets, to help with the instrumentation. And these guys included Billy Lewis on drums, Larry Taylor on bass, and Jerry McGee on guitar. And Boyce and Hart also played in the band. Now, Kirshner agreed to this, but he made one stipulation. He wanted one of his boys to kind of oversee things, and that was Jack Keller, a producer from the New York office. So Keller basically came and assisted Boyce and Hart with the production. Another guitarist that Boyce and Hart wanted to use was somebody that had been doing demos for them. This was Louis Shelton. Now, this is how Shelton got his start, working for Boyce and Hart and doing small stuff. And when the Monkees were picked up by NBC, Boyce and Hart coaxed him out of his job in Las Vegas to come to Los Angeles and help with the recordings. Now, Boyce and Hart also did some auditioning with the Monkees in the studio to figure out what voices and who's going to be on what. And they basically settled on Mickey and Davy as the vocalists, with Mickey with the faster pop numbers and Davy with the ballads. They felt overall that Peter's voice was the least commercial of the four. We are now in May of 1966. Now, the show's got to air in September of 66, so time is getting tight here. And while Boyce and Hart are scrambling to get music together, shooting officially starts for the television show. Now, UPI picked up on this. There must have been press releases on the Monkees, and this is what the UPI story said. It said, quote, "These are the Monkees, a wholly manufactured singing group of attractive young men brought together by NBC TV as a secret weapon aimed at Batman." So they're kind of going up against Batman, is kind of that youth market. But I thought this was interesting that they called them wholly manufactured, even before even seeing the show. So this is something that's going to continually haunt the Monkees, and it apparently was haunting them before the show even aired. So in June of 1966, as Boyce and Hart are getting some songs together, Raybert realizes, hey, we need not just songs for an album, but for a whole first season. So this is like at least 2+ albums worth of material. So they go back to Kirshner, and they need Kirshner's help. So Kirshner kind of works out a deal with him where he's music supervisor of the Monkees. And from this is where they start getting more songs given to them. Kirshner was named musical supervisor, and essentially they handed all the music control over to him. Now, one of the things that was going on now that they were filming so much is the filming lasted all day. So makeup call was at 7:30 in the morning. They often shot till 7 or 7:30 at night. And then they'd have to go do musical sessions with the producers. So you can see how there was only time for them to do voices. There was really no way for them to do anything but that. And when they did get to the studio at night, oftentimes they were pretty exhausted. So what would happen generally is Boyce and Hart had a little trouble with the Monkees because they'd be goofing around. So if you had too many of them together, they goof around, wouldn't get as much done. So they started bringing them in separately, and that was just a faster way for them to work. As I had mentioned, Rafelson and Schneider had originally led the group to believe that they could play on the records, but based on the shooting schedule, it just wasn't practical. So they had to kind of renege on that, but some compromises had to be made. And Nesmith, who wanted to produce, and he had a couple songs that he brought of his own songs, and they allowed him to record those songs. But if he was in the producer's chair, he's behind the glass. That means he can't play on it. So Nesmith insisted on having Peter Tork play on it. So this was a way for the Monkees to try to get a little bit of control, but very little, because Peter Tork was like the fourth or fifth guitarist on a couple of these tracks. And one time Tork even worked out an instrumental passage on guitar for them that would have been nice, but he was told very politely, hey, we can't use that. We just don't have time to have the outside stuff like you brought in to add. We just can't do that. So Tork was really disappointed because he also felt he would have some musical input, because that was really playing to his strengths. He wasn't a great singer, but instrumentally he was very strong. So unfortunately they weren't going to use him. Now with Kirshner being involved, he had to get things done quickly, and him and Nesmith already didn't quite hit it off. So one thing he did, by giving Nesmith these couple things to produce, it kind of got Nesmith out of the way and got him in the booth behind the glass. And that was one way to kind of allow the other stuff to proceed. There was one incident where Nesmith was in the studio and Don Kirshner didn't come to the session. And Nesmith was very, very put off by this. And he called up Kirshner and he said, well, no, you're fine on your own, just letting you do your own thing and giving you some space. And, Nesmith took affront to that. It's like, I gotta give it to Kirshner. He was actually letting Nesmith have a couple songs to produce them and to have some of his own players on there. And, it was actually Nesmith that had kind of a row with Goffin and King. That was a song that they collaborated on, Sweet Young Thing, that sent Carole King home in tears, apparently. So Nesmith was a bit of a pill to deal with. So I can't blame this all on Kirshner. The idea of not playing instruments on these records really only affected Nesmith and Tork. As far as Dolenz was concerned, he took up the drums as a prop. It didn't really affect him or Jones. Jones couldn't really play instruments anyway, so he could lend his voice like the others. So it was really a non-factor for half the group. As the songs are added and being worked on, Kirshner added a few songs, and at this point, the boys are starting to get their television personas down. Much like the Beatles were saddled with these images by the press, so too the Monkees kind of got this as well. Here are their TV personas. We have Davy Jones as the cute one, Mickey Dolenz as the zany one, Mike Nesmith as the stoic, and Peter Tork as the lovable dummy. Now, the lovable dummy was a persona that he had kind of already created in his folk days in Greenwich Village, and that was just part of his shtick. As deadlines approached, the band needed to have an album completed and a single. So they needed one more song for the album, and Boyce and Hart came up with Last Train to Clarksville. Now, this was inspired by the Beatles' Paperback Writer. And the fate of Paperback Writer, Hart heard something like Take the Last Train or something like that. So that was the germination of Last Train to Clarksville. And they banged out a gem.
And I don't know if I'm ever coming home.
Now, the lead guitar work in Last Train to Clarksville is by Louis Shelton, and it's the highlight of the song. And it's one of the things, that guitar work in that song helped create the Monkees sound. All the LA producers who didn't want anything to do with Louis Shelton, now he's their best friend, and they all wanted to hire him. So, strangely enough, Don Kirshner didn't like this song. And he stated that it wasn't personal. It wasn't like a boy-girl song. And he had a problem with the train theme, which I find very strange because it seemed like Kirshner was living in the 1940s based on the kind of music he was offering. And, train travel was pretty big then. So I guess the man with the golden ear just wasn't hearing it. But as it turned out, One of the other choices for the first single was Saturday's Child, but that got passed over and they did release Clarksville as the single. Clarksville was released 4 weeks before the premiere of the show, August 16th of 1966, and this was bolstered by a $100,000 advertising campaign. Now this was an unprecedented amount to spend on a single, but they were launching a brand new group on a brand new label. So Cold Gems was the new label created for this project. And during this time, the Monkees weren't filming, they were making tons of personal appearances. DJs were hand delivering the single to all these radio stations. And it took 11 weeks for Clarksville to hit the #1 position, and it slowly climbed. But that's what it took to launch a new group, and they got their #1. Okay, let's look at the parallel world of the Beatles at this time, because it's kind of interesting how, as the Beatles were kind of becoming more serious, we have the Monkees come up to essentially take the place of the Mop Tops. So August 16th, 1966 is the release of Clarksville. August 29th, a couple weeks later, the Beatles' last live performance is at Candlestick Park. And September 12th, the Monkees premiere on NBC.
Here we come, walking down the street. We get the funniest looks.
So right after the show comes out on the 12th of September, by September 14th, the Beatles are back home and they scatter to take a much needed 2 months off. At this time, in September of 66, it's the beginning of about 6 months of no new Beatle material. And in this vacuum, the Monkees take hold with not only music, but with video, which was very powerful. So with Last Train to Clarksville a big hit, the show was also popular, but the ratings were average, and the reaction ranged from glowing to confused. This approach that Rafelson and Schneider used, fast movement, breaking the fourth wall, all this stuff was rather new and a little bit jarring to some audiences. But the younger audience seemed to really like it. And even though the ratings were a little disappointed because they were up against Gilligan's Island, which was basically the same age group, the Daily Variety had an interesting quote. They said, "Run your eye over the credits to the Monkees. There was not one familiar name there." Well, that's because Rafelson and Schneider used directors who didn't really direct before. And they did this because they wanted this spontaneity. They wanted this type of action to have this natural appeal. That's what gave this show such a different look. And it added to the spontaneity. So episode 1 was Royal Flush, and it included the hit song Last Train to Clarksville, the B-side Take a Giant Step, and this just doesn't seem to be my day.
There's just no percentage in remembering the past. It's time you learn to live again at last. You went away. This just doesn't seem to be my day.
Now the Monkees' first album, here it is, released on October 10th, 1966, and had a smattering of very nice songs.
Enough to guide me, confide in me. Whoa, whoa.
Monday had a sad child, always feeling low down. I'm gonna back up all the pain, I'm gonna keep it in my heart. I'm gonna catch me the fastest train. I'm gonna make
I Want to Be Free was lead sung by Davy Jones, and that's kind of the group's Yesterday, their nice, pretty ballad. Saturday's Child was written by David Gates. It could have been released as a single, but was not. Tomorrow's Going to Be Another Day, and another great delivery by Mickey Dolenz. So Michael Nesmith also contributed 2 songs.
I have no more than I did before, but now I've got all that I need. Sweet young thing.
Peter Tork plays on both of these Nesmith songs, and the country feel gives the album a kind of a diverse lineup of songs, which probably wouldn't have been there if Nesmith hadn't been so headstrong about getting some of his songs on.
I'm gonna buy me a dog.
A dog? A dog? Why?
'Cause I need a let's dance on. Oh baby, come on. Let's dance on till the dawn, have fun till
Not sure if those songs broaden the range of the album, but they're certainly fun, kind of comedy numbers almost, at least Gonna Buy Me a Dog is. And Let's Dance On is an example where the bass player didn't show up and they recorded the song without a bass and it just kind of passed through. But that's how fast they had to get this thing on the air, and that some of that lo-fi spontaneity actually worked in the favor of the group. Now, overall, we have 6 lead vocals by Mickey Dolenz, 3 by Davy Jones, 2 by Mike Nesmith, and Peter Tork is persona non grata with 0. Now, one thing I like to say about this album, it's one of the best pop albums of the 60s. It has so much fun, it has so much energy, and it's just one of those albums that is just, to this day, is a pleasure to listen to. And everybody was getting this together, everybody was just so naive that everything just came together after all this hard work. And it shows on this record. And it ended up selling 5 million copies. The Monkees TV show injected a breath of fresh air into a pop music industry that was all of a sudden becoming very serious. Now, the timing of the show was perfect, and we're going to see how the Monkees handled their fame in part 2 here on Pop Goes the 60s.